The Batman villains are some of the best characters in comics. The Joker, Catwoman, Ra's al Ghul and Poison Ivy. All of them are great, but they are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Batman villains. Outside of the main rogues gallery, Batman has countless other enemies. They are not as popular as the main villains, and people hardly ever talk about them. They are the underrated enemies of Batman, and there was a period in the 90s when these characters were quite prominent. This period started in the late 1980s when writer Alan Grant and artist Norm Breyfogle initiated a movement to bring new villains for Batman. They created some of the most original characters, including Cornelius Stirk, the Ratcatcher, Cadaver, the Corrosive Man, Anarchy, and my personal favorite, the Ventriloquist and Scarface. The Grant and Breyfogle run was the start of a new vision, in which all the creative teams in the Batman comics worked together. After the success of the Destroyer storyline, they continued to showcase Batman against new and original enemies, and in this episode, we will understand why the underrated Batman villains are a necessary evil. In 1992, the Batman comics went through a series of changes. The first and most significant one was the last story with Norm Breyfogle as the main Batman artist. The Return of Scarface was the second appearance of the character that Norm co-created with Alan Grant. On his first appearance, Ventriloquist was arrested alongside his puppet, Scarface. Now he is released from prison and tries to reclaim his lost criminal empire from the street gangs that have taken over. In this confrontation between organized crime and street-level criminals, the main focus is the split personality of the Ventriloquist and his violent alter ego, Scarface. The Ventriloquist is the most popular enemy in this whole video, because he has the qualities of an excellent Batman villain. The Ventriloquist is insane. His duality is an extreme version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which works so well with Two-Face. The concept of a living doll like Scarface that comes alive when nobody is controlling it is borderline horror, which, as I always say, is a fitting element in any Batman story. Scarface is also based upon the traditional gangsters for whom pride and honor is above greed, making his motivations hard to tell, while his actions shape the criminal landscape of a city. The Return of Scarface showcases the great potential of an underrated villain. It was a three-part crossover between Batman and Detective Comics, and the final story with Norm Breyfogle as the main artist. After this, Norm was transferred to a new Batman comic called Shadow of the Bat. The next big change happened when writer Peter Milligan left the comics. After the Idiot story, Milligan came up with a new villain in Detective Comics 643. This enemy is called the Librarian, because he kills people and takes their bodies to different places of Gotham, following the arrangement of a library, as if the corpses were books. The Librarian had a lot of potential to become a classic Batman villain. He is insane, smart, and deadly. The problem is that the story was too focused on his very complex modus operandi. There is not enough exploration of the dark side of the Librarian's psychology, so we never really understand him as a character. The Librarian doesn't make any more appearances, and neither does Peter Milligan. His contributions as a regular Batman writer end with this story. Meanwhile, a new creative team for Batman was coming together, but before they took over, a couple of Batman issues were filled in by guest creators. Issues 477 and 478 were written by John Wagner and illustrated by Cam Kennedy. The highlight of these issues are the photographic covers by Tom Taggart. They provide a stop-motion feel to the image of Batman and his new enemy. This two-part story introduced the Gargoyle, a demonic creature who is actually a mad scientist that experimented with forces beyond his control. The Gargoyle is a power-hungry creature and feeds on the blood of humans. His only weakness is that he needs chemicals to transform. Of course, Batman finds a way to revert the transformation and captures the mad scientist. The concept of the story was intriguing. The villain was not. The Gargoyle is similar to Man-Bat, with a scientific experiment gone wrong, but unlike Man-Bat, the Gargoyle is not noble, and his human side can't control his actions when he is transformed. The potential for a great character is there, but somehow it has never appeared again. If you ask me, I would say it's because the story was a bit dull. In fact, all of these stories have been missing something. In all of them, Batman has been working alone. and that's because they were waiting for the new creative team in Detective Comics before bringing Robin back to the spotlight. After 2 successful Robin miniseries and a 3-part storyline in Batman, Chuck Dixon and Tom Lyle began their run in Detective Comics with issue 644. In their first storyline, Dixon and Lyle introduced Elmo Galvan, a villain similar to the Electrocutioner. He controls electricity thanks to a machine that also provides his movement. Galvan is a man on a vendetta. He wants to kill all the people who assisted to his execution in the electric chair. He didn't die, but as a result he became powered by electricity. Galvan wants to kill Gordon, but first he will have to fight Batman and Robin. This 3-part story is full of action and it's fun to read. Batman is clinically dead for about a minute, and Chuck Dixon's Robin is also a pleasant joy. Tom Lyle is a great artist and conveys the action in the most realistic and elegant way. The villain is also exciting to watch, and the final showdown is fantastic. However, there is something about him that just doesn't fit. His motivations are too simple. He is out for revenge. If he would get it, then what would happen? It's a character with a one-track mind, and the chances of successfully reusing him are minimal. His abilities are also misplaced. Batman has faced many electric enemies in the past, going as far back as the Silver Age, but none of them ever became great villains. And that's because elemental villains do not work in Batman. These characters are better enemies of heroes like Spider-Man, who needs to be challenged by enemies who can control elemental forces. The most important electric villain is, after all, a Spider-Man enemy. The villains of Gotham, on the other hand, work better when they are dark reflections of Batman's psychology, when they challenge Batman mentally as well as physically. Our next villain is a prime example of that. Pagan was created in Batman 479 by Alan Grant and Tom Mandrake, and she is the first female villain of this episode. Like the Electrocutioner, Pagan's motivation is revenge, but unlike him, she was not a criminal, and her background is much more tragic. Her real name is Marian Mercer, and her younger sister was a victim of sexual violence. In order to avenge her, Marian became Pagan and trained her body in order to destroy the sexual predators who assaulted her sister. Pagan is not much different from Batman, another victim of violence who prepared herself to fight back. The problem is that Pagan takes the law into her own hands. We as readers sympathize with her, and so does Batman, but she is not willing to work with the law. Pagan is a great character. She has an enormous potential for character development, and she could have even become a unique ally for Batman. Unfortunately, she made very few appearances, and after the 90s, she vanished. The issue was probably the character design. The idea behind this costume was to showcase the physical power of a woman, a power that is above that of the average man. Unfortunately, the costume falls short of sexist, objectifying the body of a woman. Pagan can also be guilty of misandry, or the hate of men, a difficult and complex character to write for, especially considering that most Batman writers are men. Shortly after this issue, Alan Grant ended his run as the main Batman writer, and the new creative team was finally introduced. For one last run, Jim Aparo returns as the main Batman artist, and Doug Moench, the iconic Bronze Age writer, begins his second and final run in the Batman comics. In Batman number 481, Moench and Aparo created the Harpy, another female villain, although not as complex as Pagan. She was Max Isu's assistant, who adopts a criminal personality after she hits her head. The Harpy is strong and agile, but besides that, she is not a good character. The potential for a great villain is there, but it is utterly squandered. Following her are Crash and Burn, the last underrated villains of this episode. They are a couple of bank robbers, modeled after Bonnie and Clyde, but with an extreme attitude and a tendency for explosives. Eventually they arrive to Gotham, where their criminal careers come to an end, after they crash and burn. These two are the prime example of disposable villains, characters who are meant to fill one story and nothing more. But that is not a bad thing. These minor villains are not meant to become the next Joker. Their stories may not be the greatest, but they are valuable because they bring new elements to the Batman mythos. Thanks to these villains, the classic enemies are not overused, and they allow writers to explore themes and concepts that Batman has probably not encountered before. In the 90s, the writers, artists and readers experienced the creation of new history. The goal was not to create the next big thing, but but simply keeping the legacy alive, with fresh ideas and originality. The classic villains would appear, for sure, but only on special occasions, moments that would be worth of their value. The creators back then understood that there was no point for the Joker to show up if nothing serious would happen. These comics are more imaginative than most of the modern comics because they give us variety, creativity, and sheer potential for great, new and different stories. Just remember that the next time you read a Batman story with an underrated villain. I was about to end the video there, but I couldn't pass the chance to mention how the changes that happened here were also a reflection of the changes happening in the continuity of the comics. The return of Doug Moench as a writer is echoed by the return of Harvey Bullock, the character that Moench developed in the Bronze Age. The idea was to expand the supporting cast of the GCPD, and so they introduced a new character called Renée Montoya. She was originally created for the animated series, and since the Batman team knew all about it beforehand, they brought her into the comics first. They also start to mention Jeremiah Arkham as the new manager of Arkham Asylum, and Commissioner Gordon proposes to Sarah Essen in the Electrocutioner story. In Batman number 480, the last issue written by Alan Grant, the father of Tim Drake is reintroduced into the story, where he and his son move into the mansion next to Wayne Manor. Jack Drake also hires a personal doctor for his recovery, a lady called Dr. Chandra King-Solving. All of these changes and characters that suddenly appeared happened for a reason. They wanted a streamlined continuity, as they were preparing the characters and setting the stage for a massive event that is getting closer and closer. But perhaps the most interesting change that happened in these comics was the disappearance of Vicky Vale. Ever since the first Batman movie, she was spotted in the comics frequently, almost always as Bruce's romantic partner. In the Scarface story, however, their relationship reaches a critical point, where Bruce has to decide whether to tell her the truth or break up. The moment plays almost exactly as that same scene from the movie, but in the end, Bruce keeps the secret and Vicky Vale moves out of his life. The popularity of the first Batman movie had ended, so there was no more reason to keep Vicky Vale in the comics, especially since Batman Returns was right around the corner, and Vicky was not in that movie. Batman Returns, Nightfall, and the animated series. Big things are coming, and if you want to see those videos, then subscribe now, and come back for the next one, where we will take a look at one of the strangest Riddler stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.